The gun pressed cold against Benjamin Stone's chest was not what stopped Bessie Ramsey's breath. It was the look in his eyes, the absolute, unwavering calm of a man who had already decided he would die before he let her walk out of that courthouse alone. "Step away from her," Marshal Greer said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man who had never once questioned whether his authority was just. "This woman is property of the Ramsey estate, and she will be remanded to the custody of her father's creditors until the debt is settled." Bessie stood beside Benjamin on the wooden steps of the Caldwell County Courthouse, her hands trembling, her blue calico dress damp with sweat under the blazing Kansas sun of July 1882. 12 men stood behind Greer, 12 guns, one lawman with a badge that had been bought by the same hands now reaching to take everything from her. Benjamin did not flinch. He did not step away. He turned slowly to look at Bessie, and in that moment she saw something in his face that made her stomach drop, not fear, not anger, but something rawer and quieter than either. Understanding. "Bessie," he said, his voice low, meant only for her ears through the roaring silence of that moment, "ask me." She shook her head. The word stuck somewhere behind her ribs. She knew what asking would cost him. She had known for 3 weeks. His land, his livelihood, his name tied irrevocably to hers, and all the catastrophic debt her father had left behind like a rotting foundation beneath a beautiful house. She had come to Caldwell, Kansas in the spring with dreams of teaching school and building something honest, and instead she had walked directly into the wreckage of a dead man's secrets and a corrupt system designed to make her pay for all of it. "I can't," she whispered. Benjamin Stone turned back to face Marshal Greer and his 12 guns, and he reached into the breast pocket of his dark vest and produced a folded document, holding it out with the steadiness of a man who had spent the night making peace with his choice. "I know what it costs you to ask," he said, and he was looking at Greer but speaking to Bessie. "So let me make it easy and just say yes." The silence that followed cracked open like a dry canyon under sudden rain. And Bessie Ramsey understood in that moment that the story of how she and Benjamin Stone arrived on those courthouse steps was a story that had begun not with catastrophe, but with something far more dangerous. The slow, quiet certainty of 2 people finding each other inside an impossible situation. 6 weeks earlier, Bessie Ramsey had arrived in Caldwell, Kansas on the afternoon train with $43 in her purse, a teaching certificate from Lawrence, a small trunk of practical clothes, and the letter from the school board offering her the position of schoolmistress at the newly built Caldwell Prairie School. She was 24 years old, dark-haired, with the kind of steady brown eyes that people tended to read as confidence even when what she felt inside was something closer to controlled terror. The letter from the school board had been arranged by her second cousin, Mrs. Edna Falk, who lived in Caldwell with her husband, and had written to Bessie in April with the practical tone of a woman who understood necessity. Bessie's father, Thomas Ramsey, had died in March. He had died leaving behind not a house, not savings, not the small printing business in Lawrence that Bessie had believed was profitable. He had died leaving behind a debt of $4,200 owed to a consortium of businessmen in Wichita, a debt secured against a property deed in Caldwell County that Bessie had never once heard her father mention. She had learned about the Caldwell property from a lawyer named Harwick 3 days after the funeral. Harwick was the kind of man who wore his prosperity like a second skin, and whose sympathy was the thinnest possible veneer over his hunger to collect. The debt, he explained, was legitimate, documented, and due within 90 days. The property in Caldwell County, 40 acres on the South Fork of Bluff Creek, had been Thomas Ramsey's investment. An investment that had never paid a single dollar in return. Bessie had taken the schoolmistress position in Caldwell for 2 reasons. The salary was $18 a month, which was reasonable, and Caldwell was where the property was, which meant she could try to understand what she was actually dealing with before the 90 days ran out. She stepped off the train into the flat, dusty expanse of a Kansas afternoon and stood on the platform with her trunk beside her, looking at Caldwell with the practical assessment of a woman who had stopped being sentimental somewhere around the time she realized her father's coffin had to be paid for on credit. Caldwell in the summer of 1882 was a cattle town in its last bright years of the Texas cattle trade. The Kishom Trail still funneled longhorns north from Texas, and Caldwell sat at the edge of the Cherokee Outlet, a border town between the settled world and something older and wilder. Main Street ran straight and wide, with false-fronted saloons and a general store and a livery, and a brand-new courthouse that gleamed white in the afternoon sun as if trying to prove something. Dust moved through everything like a second weather system. Edna Falk met her at the station in a buckboard wagon with the no-nonsense efficiency of a woman who had organized her entire life around making things work. She was 40, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, and she hugged Bessie with genuine warmth before immediately handing her the reins and saying, "Sit up straight or people will think you're scared." "I am scared," Bessie said. "Of course you are," Edna said, climbing up beside her. "Do it anyway." They drove to the Falk house on the eastern edge of town, and over a supper of salt pork and cornbread, Edna explained what she knew about the property on Bluff Creek. "Your father bought that land in '78, Edna said, pouring coffee with the straightforward manner of a woman delivering difficult medicine. "He bought it from a man named Colton Drake, who was selling off parcels he'd acquired from the Cherokee Outlet land grab. The transaction was not," she chose her words carefully, "entirely clean." "What does that mean?" Bessie asked. "It means Drake had a habit of selling land he had debatable right to sell, using money that had debatable legitimacy as its source, to men who asked debatable questions about where it came from. Your father was one of those men. He paid $300 for 40 acres he believed would be worth 10 times that when the railroad expanded. The railroad did not expand that direction. And the $4,000 debt." Edna set down her coffee cup. "That is the part that concerns me most. The consortium in Wichita, a man named Vernon Ashe leads it. They claim your father borrowed against that property in 1880. But there are people in this county who say the debt document was manufactured after your father died, when Ashe learned the property might be accessible." Bessie felt the cold certainty of a trap closing around her. "Is it legitimate or not?" "Harwick says yes. The county clerk, who is also Ashe's man, says yes. The document exists and has been filed." Edna looked at her steadily. "But there is one person in this county who might be able to prove otherwise if the truth is findable." "Who?" "Benjamin Stone," Edna said. "He owns the adjacent property. He knew Colton Drake. He was present for some of those transactions in '78. And he is the one man in Caldwell County that Vernon Ashe has not yet managed to buy, frighten, or destroy." Bessie slept that night in the small, clean room Edna had prepared for her, staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind move across the prairie. And she thought about the shape of her situation with the clear-eyed assessment that had gotten her through 24 years of a life that had never been particularly easy. She thought about the teaching position, which she needed. She thought about the 40 acres on Bluff Creek, which she did not want but which she could not simply abandon without understanding what was attached to it. She thought about Vernon Ashe and Marshall Greer and the Wichita Consortium, and she felt the specific dread of a person who has realized they are standing in the middle of someone else's long game. And she thought, unexpectedly and with a sort of irritated curiosity, about a man named Benjamin Stone, who Edna Falk had described as the one honest man in the county. She did not meet him the next morning, because the school needed her immediate attention. The Caldwell Prairie School was a one-room building on the north edge of town, recently finished, smelling of new wood and whitewash. 22 children ranging in age from 6 to 15 would arrive Monday morning. Bessie spent Friday and most of Saturday organizing the room, cataloging the meager supply of books and slates, and setting up the geography maps that had arrived in a crate from Topeka. The work was familiar and steadying, the kind of practical problem-solving that quieted the noise in her mind. She was nailing a map of the United States to the wall on Saturday afternoon when she heard boots on the schoolhouse steps and turned to find a man in the doorway. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the lean, sun-darkened build of a man who worked his own land. He wore a dark hat, plain work clothes, a vest, and no gun visible on his hip, which was notable in Caldwell. His face was angular, with deep-set gray eyes that took in the room and then Bessie with the same measured attention. He was perhaps 30, maybe 31. He had the kind of stillness that came not from being slow but from having learned a long time ago that deliberate movement accomplished more than hurried movement. "You are the new schoolmistress," he said. It was not a question. "Bessie Ramsey," she said, and watched his expression shift very slightly, but she caught it. "Benjamin Stone," he said. "I own the property adjacent to your father's land on Bluff Creek." "I know who you are," she said. "My cousin told me." He nodded slowly. He looked at the map she had been attempting to hang, which was currently held at one corner and drooping at 3 others. "May I?" He gestured toward it. She handed him the remaining nails and the small hammer, somewhat surprised by her own willingness to accept help from a stranger, and he crossed the room and held the map level with the practiced efficiency of a man accustomed to solving physical problems, then drove the nails in with 3 precise strokes each. He stepped back and looked at the result. Then he looked at her. "You came about the land," he said. "I came to teach school," she said. "I am also concerned about the land, yes. Edna told you about the debt claim." "She did." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the prairie grass with a long, dry sigh. Somewhere down Main Street, a horse objected loudly to something. "Miss Ramsey," he said, "I should tell you plainly that what is happening to you is not an accident. Vernon Ashe has been acquiring properties in this county for 2 years by a method that works like this. He identifies properties with unclear titles or absent owners. He manufactures or inflates debt claims against them. He uses Marshal Greer and the county clerk to legitimize those claims in the courthouse records, and then he collects. Your father's property is the cleanest opportunity he has seen yet because your father is dead and you are an unmarried woman from out of county who may not know how to fight it." Bessie looked at him steadily. "But I can fight it." Something moved through his gray eyes. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. "You can try," he said. "But you need to understand what you are fighting. Ashe controls the marshal, the clerk, 2 of the 3 county commissioners, and the local judge. That leaves you very few legitimate avenues." "What avenues exist?" "A district court appeal to Wichita. But that requires documentation proving the debt claim is fraudulent, which requires access to records that Ashe controls, and a lawyer willing to take the case, which is difficult when Ashe has made it very clear that any lawyer in Caldwell who opposes him will find his own affairs suddenly complicated." "I will not be bullied out of my legal inheritance," Bessie said, and she said it quietly but with the absolute certainty of a woman who meant exactly every word. Benjamin Stone looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she did not expect. He smiled. It was not a large smile, barely a change really, just a softening around his eyes and a slight movement at the corner of his mouth, but it was genuine and it changed his entire face. "No," he said. "I don't believe you will be." He picked up his hat from where he had set it on a desk. "I will be at Bluff Creek tomorrow morning. If you want to see the property before the school week begins, you are welcome to come." "I will be there," she said. He nodded once, put his hat on, and walked out. Bessie stood in the schoolhouse with the properly hung map of the United States and the sound of his boots fading down the steps, and she thought, with the careful honesty she always applied to her own internal states, that Benjamin Stone was a man who made a room feel different when he was in it. She was not sure yet whether that was a good or a complicated thing. Sunday morning found Bessie on horseback. Edna had loaned her the steadiest of her husband's horses, a reliable roan gelding named Sam, riding the 3 miles south of town to Bluff Creek as the day was still cool, and the prairie was gold and green in the early light. July in Kansas was not kind about temperature, but the mornings had a brief mercy before the heat settled in like a physical weight. Benjamin Stone was already there when she arrived, standing at the edge of the creek bank with a cup of coffee, looking at the water. His horse, a dark bay, was tied to a cottonwood a little distance away. There was a small fire nearby with a coffee pot still on it, which told her he had expected her to come and had planned accordingly, which for reasons she did not fully examine gave her a small, warm feeling that she immediately set aside to focus on the practical matter at hand. He poured her a cup of coffee without asking. She accepted it gratefully, and then walked her along the boundary of the 40 acres while explaining what he knew about the property's history. The land was neither spectacular nor worthless. It had water access from Bluff Creek, which was genuinely valuable in a dry county. The soil on the northern section was reasonable farming ground. The southern section was rougher, more suited to grazing than cultivation. In 1878, when Colton Drake had sold it to her father, it had been priced at $300, which was fair for what it was. What made it interesting to Vernon Ashe in 1882 was not its agricultural value. It was its position. Benjamin Stone walked her to the southeast corner of the property and pointed. "The railroad is coming," he said. "Not the direction they announced. The route they announced is the misdirection. The actual proposed route for the Santa Fe extension runs through this valley, and your father's 40 acres sits directly where they will need to put the water tower and maintenance yard." Bessie looked at the unremarkable stretch of creek bank and dry grass and understood immediately. This land is worth considerably more than $4,000 if the railroad comes. "Considerably," Benjamin confirmed. "Ashe knows because he has a man inside the railroad planning office. He has been positioning himself to own every key parcel along the route. Your father's property is the last significant piece he does not control." "So the debt claim," Bessie said, "is almost certainly manufactured. Your father may have borrowed money from Ashe's consortium, but not $4,000, and probably not against this specific land. The documentation was most likely created after your father's death, when there was no one to contradict it." "Can you prove that?" Benjamin was quiet for a moment. "I was present in 1878 when Drake sold your father this land," he said. "I witnessed the transaction. I know what the original document said because I helped your father record the deed at the county clerk's office. The clerk at the time was a man named Purvis who was honest. Purvis died in 1880. His successor is Ashe's man, but the original deed record would have gone to the state office in Topeka as well. If Ashe has not managed to corrupt Topeka, and that would be significantly harder to do, then the original record is there and it contradicts the fraudulent claim." Bessie processed this. The creek moved past them, quiet and persistent. A red-tailed hawk circled high above the south pasture. "We need to get to Topeka," she said. "Someone needs to go to Topeka," he agreed. "And someone needs to keep watch here, because once Ashe realizes you are investigating rather than capitulating, things will move faster. How much time do I have before the 90 days expire?" 53 days from today." Bessie looked at the land her father had bought with what she now understood was a mixture of investment hope and perhaps a degree of moral ambiguity she would have preferred not to know about, and she felt the complexity of inheriting not just a debt but a story. She thought about her father, not with the simple grief of recent loss, but with the more complicated sorrow of understanding a person better after they are gone than you ever managed while they were living. "Mr. Stone," she said, "why are you helping me?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Because what Ashe is doing is wrong. Because I have watched him do it to 3 other families in this county, and I was not in a position to stop it each time, and I am tired of that feeling. And because," he paused, and something crossed his face that was harder to read, "your father was a decent enough man, whatever his poor decisions were. He did not deserve to leave you in this." It was not the whole truth, she could sense that, but it was honest as far as it went, and she did not press. They rode back toward town mostly in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that exists between people who are each busy thinking about the same problem and trust the other to be doing the same. Monday morning, school began. 22 children arrived, ranchers' children and shopkeepers' children, and the daughter of the livery owner and 2 boys whose father worked the cattle drives and was currently somewhere in Texas. Bessie threw herself into the work with the total absorption that teaching always brought her, and for 6 hours a day, the immediate crisis of her inheritance receded, and she was simply a schoolmistress in a one-room schoolhouse in Kansas, teaching multiplication and reading and the geography of a country that was still, in 1882, in the process of figuring out what it was going to be. Benjamin came to the schoolhouse on Wednesday with a letter for her. He did not come inside. He left it with the older children who were playing outside at the noon break. The letter was from a lawyer in Wichita named Caldwell, who was, Benjamin had written in an accompanying note, one of the few men of law in the region who had not been compromised and who had successfully opposed Ash's operations on one previous occasion. Prute was willing to review the case, but he would need the Topeka records and a sworn affidavit from any witnesses to the original 1878 transaction. She wrote back that evening. She would speak to the school board about a brief absence. She would need Benjamin's affidavit, and she would need to know if he could accompany her to Wichita to meet with Prute, because traveling alone as a woman was possible but significantly more complicated. His reply came the next morning. He would ride to Wichita with her on Saturday, if she could arrange to leave the school in the care of a substitute for the following Monday. Edna's older daughter, a capable 17-year-old named Clara, could manage the younger children for a day. They rode to Wichita on Saturday, leaving before dawn to make the 30-mile journey in the relative cool of the morning. They rode side by side on the long, flat road, and the conversation that developed between them over those hours was the kind of conversation that happens when 2 intelligent people with nothing to do but talk discover with some surprise how much they actually have to say to each other. She learned that Benjamin Stone had come to Kansas from Ohio in 1875, at 23 years old, with $200, a horse, and the straightforward ambition of a young man who wanted to own his own land. He had bought the Bluff Creek property, 210 acres, and spent 4 years building it into a working cattle operation. He ran 300 head now, had 4 hired hands, and had built a house with his own hands over 2 winters that was, he said without particular pride, solid and warm and entirely paid for. He had never married. She did not ask why, but he offered it without being asked, with the directness she was already beginning to recognize as his consistent mode. There was a woman in '79, he said. She came west from Illinois with her family. We understood each other to be heading towards something. Then her father moved the family to Colorado for the silver, and she chose to go with them. It was the right choice for her, and it was the end of that. That is a very sensible way to describe heartbreak, Bessie said. He glanced at her sideways. Is it inaccurate? No, she said. Only most people do not manage it so cleanly. I had a year to work through it, he said. By the time I was working through it, I had a cattle operation demanding my attention and 300 head of cows that are extremely unsympathetic to personal distress. She laughed. It came out more freely than she expected, and she saw the corner of his mouth lift. What about you? He asked. You came west from Lawrence. What were you leaving? She was quiet for a moment, watching the road ahead. Nothing dramatic, she said. Only the particular suffocation of a small city that had decided what I should be and was very insistent about it. My father wanted me to marry the son of his business partner, a perfectly acceptable man with perfectly acceptable prospects who bored me to a degree that I find difficult to express in polite language. How close did you come? I signed a teaching certificate instead, she said. The wedding was 6 weeks away. It was not my most tactful decision. He was quiet for a moment. Tactful, he said, and right are not always the same thing. No, she agreed. They are not. They arrived in Wichita by mid-afternoon and met with Lawyer Prout in his office above the hardware store on Douglas Avenue. Prout was a spare, precise man of 55 who listened to Bessie's situation with the focused attention of a man cataloging information as it arrived, asking occasional sharp questions and making notes in a cramped, neat hand. Benjamin provided the affidavit concerning the 1878 transaction, signing it in Prout's presence with the steady signature of a man who understood he was accepting consequences by putting his name on paper against Vernon Ashe. Prout told them what they already suspected. The case was winnable if the Topeka records were intact and matched Benjamin's affidavit. He would write to the State Archives office that week. He also told them what they had feared. Ashe would not wait quietly once he realized a legal challenge was being mounted. He would accelerate the collection timeline if he could, or find another method of removing the obstacle. He may try to make Miss Ramsey's position here untenable in other ways, Prout said, looking at her steadily. Her employment, her reputation. He has done this before. He will try to make Caldwell inhospitable enough that she leaves voluntarily. I will not leave voluntarily, Bessie said. Prout nodded slowly. Then you must be prepared for it to become unpleasant. They rode back to Caldwell on Sunday, and the conversation was quieter on the return journey, each of them processing the weight of what Prout had said. The evening light spread itself across the Kansas prairie in long gold bars, and the shadow of the cottonwoods alongside the road fell in dark stripes across the road. It was beautiful, the way difficult places can be beautiful when the light is right. Near the junction 3 miles south of Caldwell, Benjamin stopped his horse and Bessie stopped hers beside him. He was looking west, where the sky above the horizon had gone a deep, fierce orange. Bessie, he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, not Miss Ramsey. She noticed. She chose not to comment on it. Yes, she said. I want you to understand something. What I told you about why I am helping you, it was true, but it was not complete. She waited. I am also helping you because I think you are one of the most straightforwardly honest people I have encountered in a very long time, and in this county at this particular moment. That is something I am not willing to watch be destroyed. She looked at him in the orange evening light, this serious, still man who had spent the day in Wichita putting his own affairs at risk on her behalf, and she felt something shift quietly in the interior of her chest, like a lock opening that she had not realized was closed. Thank you, she said, for all of it. He nodded once, and they rode the last 3 miles into Caldwell in the gathering dark. What Prout had predicted arrived faster than any of them hoped. The following Tuesday, Bessie arrived at the schoolhouse to find 3 members of the school board waiting for her outside. The board chairman, a man named Horace Webb, who Edna had already identified to Bessie as being firmly in Ashe's social circle, informed her with careful formality that certain concerns had been raised about her suitability for the position. The concerns, as he laid them out, were breathtaking in their fabricated specificity. A story was circulating, he said, that Bessie had been seen traveling unchaperoned with Benjamin Stone to Wichita, and that the nature of the overnight trip had been, he coughed, of a personal rather than professional character. The implication was clear and deliberately disgusting. Bessie stood on the schoolhouse steps and looked at Webb with the kind of steady, contained fury that is more frightening than any display. Mr. Webb, she said, I rode to Wichita on Saturday and returned Sunday on a matter of legal business relating to my father's estate. Mr. Stone, who is a neighbor and colleague in this matter, accompanied me at my request. We traveled in daylight on a public road, met with a reputable Wichita attorney whose name and office address I am happy to provide, and there was nothing of the nature you are implying. If someone in this town has suggested otherwise, they have lied, and they have done so deliberately. Webb shifted uncomfortably. He was not a bad man, she thought, merely a man who had made the convenient choice too many times to easily reverse direction. Nevertheless, he said, the board feels that perhaps a brief period of "the school opens in 20 minutes, Bessie said. My students are arriving. If the board wishes to formally review my position, I will appear at any formal proceeding at any time they designate. Until a formal decision is made by proper process, I will continue to fulfill my contract. Good morning, Mr. Webb. She turned and went inside. After a moment, she heard the board member's footsteps retreating down the road. She got through the school day on the particular adrenaline of righteous indignation, and then, that evening, walked to Benjamin Stone's property. She had never come to his house before. She had not planned to today. But the anger needed somewhere to go, and she needed to tell him what was happening before it escalated further. His property was a quarter-mile south of town on the Bluff Creek Road. The house was exactly what he had described: solid and warm-looking, built of good timber, with a long porch across the front and a kitchen garden to the side that surprised her pleasantly. She had not pictured him as a man with a kitchen garden. He was on the porch when she arrived, mending a length of harness leather, and he set it aside and stood when he saw her coming up the road on foot. She told him. All of it, precisely and without editorializing. He listened with the absolute stillness that was his characteristic response to information he was computing. When she finished, he said, "He is trying to make you look unsuitable so the school board fires you, which removes your income and your reason to stay in Caldwell. Without income, you cannot fund a legal challenge, and without a local reason to remain, the pressure becomes more effective." "Yes," she said, "that is exactly what he is doing." "He will do worse," Benjamin said. "He will not stop at rumors." "I know," Bessie said. She was leaning against the porch railing, looking at the evening sky, and she was aware suddenly of how tired she was, not the tired of a single hard day, but the accumulated tired of weeks of managing crisis on top of grief on top of displacement. She was aware of being very far from anyone who had known her for more than a month, in a town that a powerful man was systematically working to make hostile to her presence. She was also aware of Benjamin Stone 3 feet away from her on the same porch, and the way the evening made the harsh planes of his face look more approachable, and the fact that she had walked a quarter-mile without particularly thinking about it because this was where she had wanted to come. "Bessie," he said quietly. She turned to look at him. "You are not alone in this," he said. "I want you to know that clearly." It was a simple thing to say. It went into her chest like sunlight into a cold room. "I know," she said. "Thank you." They did not say anything more that evening that was worth recording. But she stayed on his porch for another hour, and he brought coffee, and they talked about small things: the cattle operation, the school children, a book she was teaching from that he had also read, and by the time she walked back to Edna's house in the dark, she was smiling, which surprised her considerably. The following week brought the first response from Prout. The state archives in Topeka had the original 1878 deed record. It was intact. It showed a clean purchase for $300 with no encumbrances. There was no record of any subsequent borrowing against the property in the state documents. The $4,000 debt claim existed only in the county records that Ash's man had created. This was excellent news, complicated immediately by the arrival of a formal notice from Marshal Greer informing Bessie that the consortium intended to file a legal action for immediate seizure of the property, unless she paid the full amount within 10 days rather than waiting out the remainder of the original 90-day notice period. They had accelerated. Prout had warned them this might happen. Bessie rode to Benjamin's property the morning she received the notice. She did not plan what she was going to say. She found him in the south pasture checking the fence line after a night of heavy wind, and she rode out to him with the notice in her hand and her jaw set in the expression that her students had already learned meant she was thoroughly resolved about something. She handed him the notice. He read it on horseback, his bay standing patiently beneath him. 10 days, he said. 10 days, she confirmed. Pruitt needs to file an injunction to freeze the proceedings while the case is reviewed. He has already written me that he can file tomorrow if I wire him the authorization. The filing fee is $40. Benjamin looked at her. Do you have $40? I have 11, she said. And my monthly salary arrives in 16 days. He reached into his vest pocket without any drama and produced 2 folded bills which he held out to her, $20 each. She looked at them, then at him. Mr. Stone, Benjamin, I cannot take money from you. You are not taking it, he said. You are borrowing it against your salary at no interest to be repaid whenever it is convenient. The alternative is that we lose the 10-day window and the injunction cannot be filed in time. He was matter-of-fact about it, as if the decision were already made and the only question was administrative. Take the money, Bessie. Wire Pruitt today. She took the money. She wired Pruitt that afternoon, and by the following day Pruitt had filed the injunction with the district court in Wichita. Marshal Greer, when served with the injunction notice, was visibly furious in a way that told Bessie clearly that Vernon Ashe had not expected this. Ashe came to Caldwell himself the following Thursday. She saw him for the first time on Main Street, stepping out of the stage from Wichita in a fine suit and good boots, a heavy-set man of 50, with the particular confidence of a man who has not experienced meaningful opposition in a very long time. He walked directly to Marshal Greer's office and was inside for 2 hours. Then he had a long meeting with the county clerk. Then he ate dinner at the hotel. Benjamin had ridden into town that morning without Bessie knowing he was coming. He found her at the schoolhouse during the noon break and told her quietly. Ashe had been asking about Benjamin's own land, his cattle contracts, his standing loans with the Caldwell Bank. Bessie understood immediately. He is going to come at you now. He is going to try, Benjamin said, with the calm that never seemed to waver. My affairs are in better order than he may expect, but he will find something or manufacture something if he wants to badly enough. Benjamin, she said and stopped. He waited. She looked at him, this man who had helped her from the first day, who had ridden to Wichita and signed his name to documents and loaned her money and mended harness on his porch while listening to her talk through her troubles, who had never once suggested she was less capable than she was or more fragile than she wanted to be, who looked at her consistently as though she were the most interesting thing in his field of vision. And she felt the full weight of what his involvement was costing him. This is too much, she said, what you are risking for someone you knew for 3 weeks. I know what I am risking, he said, and I know exactly why I am doing it. You need not carry concern for me alongside everything else you are carrying. She looked at him for a long moment. I cannot help carrying it, she said very quietly. The something that moved through his gray eyes in response to that was not subtle. Then carry it, he said, equally quietly, as I carry concern for you, and let us leave the rest unsaid for the moment because you have a schoolroom full of children. She did. She went back inside. She taught the afternoon with complete professionalism and a heart that was beating at a slightly different rhythm than it had been before noon. The next 2 weeks were a tightening of the vice. Ashe did not leave Caldwell. He installed himself at the hotel and conducted his business from there, which meant his presence was constant and his pressure was continuous. Webb called another school board meeting, and this time formally requested that Bessie take a voluntary leave of absence, while the investigation into her conduct proceeded. She refused in writing through Pruitt, who wrote to the board that any termination of her contract without cause and due process would result in a separate legal action. The board backed down, but the atmosphere in Caldwell shifted. Some families, the ones most closely allied with Ashe's business interests, withdrew their children from her school. 7 students stopped attending. It hurt her, practically and emotionally, but the 15 who remained were delivered each morning by parents who looked her in the eye with deliberate steadiness, and that sustained her. Edna's house became a kind of informal strategy center in the evenings. Pruitt had written that the district court had accepted the injunction, and a hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks hence in Wichita, which was longer than they wanted but faster than Ash had hoped. The injunction meant the property could not be seized while the court reviewed. This was the legal situation. The personal situation was developing in the spaces between strategy discussions. In the evenings when Benjamin stopped by after the day's cattle work and sat at Edna's kitchen table with coffee. In the Sunday mornings at Bluff Creek when Bessie rode out to walk the property, and he was often already there. In the way their hands brushed when she handed him a document and neither of them moved immediately away. In the particular quality of attention they each paid to the other that was different from how either of them paid attention to anyone else. Edna watched this with the knowing patience of a woman who has been married for 20 years and recognizes the species. She said nothing directly. She ensured the coffee pot was always full and the evenings long enough for conversation to breathe. Benjamin came to the schoolhouse on a Tuesday afternoon in early August, 3 weeks before the Wichita hearing, with a look on his face that was different from his usual stillness. He was tighter, more compressed. She dismissed the remaining students early and turned to face him. "Ash has found something," he said, "or manufactured something. My bank loan, the $500 note I took out in '80 to buy the second cattle herd. He has somehow gotten the bank to call it immediately, claiming a breach of terms that does not exist. If I pay it in full within 30 days, my operation survives. If I cannot pay it, the bank has the right to attach part of my livestock, which would cripple the operation for years." "Do you have $500? She asked. "I have approximately 300 liquid," he said. "The rest is in land and cattle I cannot quickly liquidate at fair value." Bessie sat down at her desk. She thought carefully. "If you sell part of the herd now at distressed prices, you get less than fair value and you lose the animals you need for the fall drive." "Yes. And if you do not pay within 30 days, the bank attaches the herd and I spend the next several years rebuilding." "He is trying to break you," Bessie said. "If he breaks you financially, your affidavit becomes the word of a struggling rancher against a Wichita consortium, and it carries less weight." "Yes," Benjamin said. "That is the calculation." She looked at her desk. She looked at the map on the wall, the one Benjamin had helped her hang on that first Saturday afternoon, an eternity ago in the same summer. She thought about everything he had put at risk, every step he had taken toward consequence by choosing to stand with her. She thought about the 40 acres on Bluff Creek, which Pruitt had told her, if the railroad deal went as expected, would be worth somewhere between $10,000 and $15,000 within 2 years of the rail extension completion. She thought about what she was about to say, and what it would mean, and what it would cost, and what it would reveal, and she felt the specific terror of a woman who is about to put down every wall she has carefully built over 24 years of managing alone. She came to find Benjamin on the Friday evening of that week. He was on his porch again. She had noticed he worked long evenings there when the days were warm, a man comfortable in the open air. She dismounted and tied Sam to the fence post and walked up to the porch with her hands in fists at her sides that she forced, deliberately, open. He stood when he saw her face. "I have been thinking," she said, "about a solution." "Tell me," he said. "The property," she said. "If the court rules in our favor, which Pruitt believes it will based on the Topeka records, then the fraudulent debt claim is discharged and I inherit the land cleanly. And the land, with the railroad coming, will be worth considerably more than the 500 you need now." "I understand that," he said carefully, "but the court ruling is 6 weeks away and the bank note is due in 30. "I know," she said. She took a breath. "What I am about to say, I want you to understand that I have considered it carefully and that it is a practical proposition, and I am making it with full understanding of what it means." He was very still. His gray eyes were on her face with absolute attention. She made herself say it. "If we married, my property would become your asset under Kansas law, which means you could borrow against it to retire the bank note. The Bluff Creek land has value even at its current assessment, and any bank in Caldwell County would accept it as collateral. And a married woman is also, is also more difficult for Ash to pressure in the ways he has been trying to pressure me." The silence on the porch was enormous. "Bessie," he said. "I know it is extremely unconventional," she said, and her voice was steadier than she expected. "I know we have only known each other for a matter of weeks. I know it is a significant thing to ask of someone, and I want you to understand that I would not ask it if I could not also tell you honestly that my feelings toward you are not purely practical in nature." She stopped. The practical language had run out, and what was underneath it was considerably less organized. "Bessie," he said again, and his voice was quiet and warm and completely different from the neutral register he normally operated in. She looked at him. She had gone this far. She looked at him directly. "I know what it costs you to ask," he said, and the understanding in his eyes was absolute and completely unhidden. "So let me make it easy and just say yes." The world did not stop. The prairie wind kept moving through the long grass. A mockingbird somewhere in the cottonwoods continued its endless repertoire. The evening continued to be an evening. But something in the space between them changed entirely, like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting for exactly this key, and Bessie Ramsey, who had been managing alone since she was old enough to understand that no one else was going to manage for her, felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt that she did not have to manage alone. "Yes," she said, and her voice was very small. "Yes," he said. He crossed the porch in 2 steps and took her hands in both of his large, warm, calloused hands, the hands of a man who worked his own land, and held them with a careful steadiness that was entirely Benjamin Stone. "Yes to all of it. Yes to the practical necessity. Yes to what you almost said before you ran out of words. Yes to you, Bessie, all of it." She looked up at him. She had not realized until this moment, standing this close, how much height he had on her. She came to his shoulder, and how entirely different closeness felt from the careful, measured distance they had maintained for weeks. "I was not going to cry," she said. "You are not crying," he said. "I am very close to it," she said. "You are allowed," he said, and he let go of one of her hands to put his arm around her, carefully, as if she were something he did not want to break, and she leaned into the solid reality of him, and decided that she had, in the course of one completely impossible summer, managed to fall in love with the most decent man she had ever known. They were married by the Caldwell justice of the peace 6 days later. It was a small, practical ceremony. Edna and her husband Harold as witnesses, 2 of the friendliest neighboring ranchers whose wives had continued to send their children to Bessie's school. Bessie wore her best dress, which was blue wool, and Benjamin wore his only suit, which was dark and clearly infrequently worn but fit him well. She thought he looked, in his infrequently worn suit, extraordinarily handsome, and she told him so, and the color that rose in his face under his tan was something she filed away with considerable satisfaction. After the ceremony, while Edna organized the small reception in her parlor, Benjamin took Bessie aside and produced from his pocket a small gold ring, simple, elegant, exactly what she would have chosen herself if she had been consulted. "It was my mother's," he said, and slid it onto her finger. "I have been carrying it since I came west. I did not know what I was waiting for." She looked at the ring on her hand and then at him, and in the private corridor of Edna's house she reached up and kissed him, not cautiously or briefly, and he kissed her back with the same contained intensity that characterized everything he did. And when they rejoined the reception, Edna looked at both of them with the satisfied expression of a woman who had known exactly what she was doing when she invited Bessie to Caldwell. The legal proceedings moved forward with the combined force of their new position. Benjamin borrowed $200 against the Bluff Creek property from a Wichita bank. Prout recommended a bank with no local ties to Ash, and combined with his existing funds, retired the called note in full. The Caldwell Bank accepted the payment with the discomfited expression of an institution that had expected a different outcome, and Vernon Ash, informed that Benjamin Stone had successfully retired the manufactured debt crisis, was reportedly very still for a long moment and then very loud. Bessie continued teaching school. She moved into Benjamin's house at Bluff Creek, which was, she discovered with deep pleasure, everything he had said it was. Solid and warm, and built with the same attention to function and durability that characterized everything he did. She made small changes to it that were also practical. A second bookshelf in the sitting room, curtains she sewed herself in the evenings from fabric Edna helped her choose, a better arrangement of the kitchen that made the workspace more efficient. Benjamin observed these changes with quiet approval and occasionally made suggestions that she incorporated without ceremony, and the house became a house that contained two people rather than one, with the easy practicality of two people who had both been managing independently for long enough that they knew how to make space for another without losing themselves. She was happy. It surprised her, not that happiness was possible, but that it had arrived so completely and so quickly. She was still fighting a legal battle and living in a town where a powerful man was actively hostile to her existence, and managing a schoolroom of children with widely varying skill levels, and she was also, unambiguously, happier than she had been in years. This was, she concluded, largely Benjamin's fault. He was not a demonstrative man in public. He was a contained, reserved person who did not broadcast his feelings to the wider world. But in the privacy of their life together, he was quietly, consistently, thoroughly devoted. He brought her coffee every morning before she was fully awake. He read the same books she was reading so they could discuss them. He took her seriously about everything, not in the performed way of a man trying to prove himself modern, but in the baseline way of a man who had simply never considered that her mind was worth less attention than any other mind he respected. He also made her laugh more than anyone she had ever known, which she had not expected from a man who presented such a still exterior to the world. The Wichita hearing came in September. They rode to Wichita together, arriving the evening before and staying at a respectable hotel. Pruitt met them for supper to review the case, which was in excellent shape. The Topeka records were submitted as evidence. Benjamin's affidavit was admitted. 2 additional witnesses had come forward, one of the ranchers who had attended their wedding, who had also been present during a portion of the original 1878 transaction, and an elderly woman named Mrs. Cross who had been Caldwell County's unofficial land record keeper before the current clerk was installed, and who remembered the original deed distinctly. Ash's lawyer was talented. He was sharp and experienced, and he argued the consortium's position with genuine skill. But talent cannot ultimately contradict documents, and the documents were comprehensive. The district court judge ruled in Bessie's favor on the second day. The fraudulent debt claim was discharged. The 40 acres on Bluff Creek was confirmed as belonging to Bessie Ramsey, Bessie Stone free, and clear of any encumbrance. The court additionally referred the matter of the falsified county records to the state attorney general's office for investigation of fraud. Ash was in the courtroom. He sat very still when the ruling was read, and then he left without speaking to anyone. His Caldwell operation, without the Bluff Creek property, and with an attorney general investigation opening around him, was significantly more vulnerable than it had been. He was not a finished man. Men like Vernon Ash rarely collapsed quickly, but the game in Caldwell County had definitively ended in a way he had not anticipated. Bessie shook Pruitt's hand and thanked him with the genuine warmth of a woman who meant every word. Benjamin stood beside her and shook Pruitt's hand as well, and when they stepped out of the Wichita courthouse into the September afternoon, Benjamin turned to look at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. He looked relieved, truly, deeply relieved, in the way of a man who had been carrying significant weight without showing it, and had finally been allowed to set it down. She took his hand, standing on the Wichita courthouse steps in broad daylight in front of everyone passing on Douglas Avenue, and held it. "We won," she said. "You won," he said. "I helped." "We won," she said firmly, and he did not argue. They rode back to Caldwell the next morning through the long gold September light, and the prairie was vast and beautiful around them, and they talked about the land, what they would do with it, how to manage it alongside his existing operation, what the railroad might bring and how to position themselves for it wisely rather than speculatively. The conversation moved naturally from practical planning into the larger shape of the life they were building, which was not a hypothetical life, but a real and immediate one, rolling forward on the same road they were riding. Bessie returned to school on Monday to find all 15 of her remaining students, plus 4 of the 7 who had been withdrawn, plus 2 new children who had arrived in town over the summer with a family from Missouri. 21 students. The school board held a special meeting that week and formally cleared her record, with Horace Webb issuing a written statement that the previous concerns about her conduct had been found to have no merit. He did not look comfortable delivering it, but he delivered it, and she accepted it with grace because the victory was complete enough that grace was possible. She also received, at the end of October, a letter from Lawyer Prout informing her that the Attorney General's investigation had expanded and that Marshal Greer had resigned from his position, which was a direct result of the investigation's findings. A new marshal was being appointed by the county commissioners, 3 of whom were also under investigation, and in the meantime, a deputy from Wichita was maintaining order in Caldwell with the efficiency of someone not enmeshed in local corruption. The winter came early to Kansas in 1882, the first freeze arriving in mid-October with the particular authority of a season that was not going to be argued with. The house on Bluff Creek, as Benjamin had promised, was warm. He had built it to last and built it tight, and the kitchen stove heated the central rooms efficiently, and on the evenings when the wind came off the prairie like a hard hand against the walls, there was a specific satisfaction to being inside it. They spent the winter evenings with a lamp burning and books open, occasionally reading aloud to each other, which had started as a practical convenience and become a ritual neither of them wanted to give up. She was teaching him to play chess, which he approached with the same methodical seriousness he applied to everything else, and he was teaching her to play the card game whist, which she found she had an unexpected competitive streak about that made him laugh in the contained way he had, which was different from anything she had seen from him outside the privacy of home. She was 3 months pregnant before she was certain enough to tell him, which was February of 1883. He was at the kitchen table with his account books when she said it. He looked up from the accounts and was very still for a moment in the way that meant he was computing significant information. "In the summer," she said. "July, I think." He closed the account book. He stood up. He came around the table and put both hands on her face with the careful tenderness that she associated with his most unguarded moments, and he looked at her for a long time. "Are you well?" he said. "Extremely well," she said. "A little nauseous in the mornings, but Edna says that is normal and temporary." "You have already spoken to Edna. I needed to confirm my own assessment before alarming you unnecessarily." He looked at her with something so warm and so exposed on his face that she felt it like a hand pressed to her heart. "It is not an alarm," he said. "I know," she said. "It is the best news I have received in my entire life," he said. "I thought winning the court case was the best news you received," she said. "Second best," he said, and kissed her, carefully and with all the contained intensity of a man who was not contained at all, not really, not with her. The spring came. The school year ended, and Bessie discussed with the board her intention to return in the fall after the baby arrived, which they accepted with far more equanimity than they would have managed in the early days of her employment. Several things had shifted in Caldwell over the winter. 2 of the compromised county commissioners had resigned under the pressure of the Attorney General investigation. Vernon Ashe, it was reported in the Wichita Eagle in March, had been indicted on 4 counts of fraud in Sedgwick County and was facing trial in the fall. Marshal Greer had left the state entirely. The new marshal, A young man named Aldgate, who had come down from Topeka, proved to be straightforwardly honest in a way that made everyone slightly nostalgic for the simplicity of having a clear villain. The 40 acres on Bluff Creek they had decided to hold, exactly as Prout had recommended. Benjamin managed it alongside his own operation, running some cattle on the southern pasture and leasing the northern portion for a modest income while they waited for the railroad question to resolve itself definitively. In July of 1883, exactly 1 year and 2 months after Bessie Ramsey had stepped off the train in Caldwell with $43 and a teaching certificate, their son was born on a hot Tuesday morning in the house at Bluff Creek. He was solid and dark-haired, with his father's gray eyes already suggesting themselves in his unfocused newborn gaze. Edna attended the birth with the competent authority of a woman who had assisted at a dozen such events and treated them all as logistical problems to be solved. Benjamin paced the porch for 3 hours with a contained panic that was the first time Bessie had seen him anything close to rattled, and then Edna opened the door and told him to come inside. He sat beside Bessie on the bed with his son in his arms and looked at the baby with an expression that Bessie stored in her memory like pressed flowers, preserved exactly as it was, indelible. They named him Thomas for her father. Not because Thomas Ramsey had been a perfect man, but because he was her father, and because naming a child for someone is a way of saying that the complicated person they were is remembered with more love than judgment. Benjamin showed no hesitation about the name. He said, when she proposed it, "It is a good name." And that was that. The summer passed in the particular richness of a life that is busy and full and fundamentally good. Bessie nursed Thomas and recovered her strength and wrote lesson plans for the fall term, which she intended to return to in September when Thomas was 2 months old, and Edna had agreed to care for him during school hours. Benjamin ran the cattle operation with the help of his 4 hands and began, quietly, to research the process of making a formal offer to buy the small homestead adjacent to his north pasture, whose elderly owner had indicated she was ready to sell. The neighbor, an 80-year-old widow named Mrs. Haverson, who had homesteaded the 160 acres with her late husband in 1870, sold to Benjamin and Bessie jointly in September for a fair price. The combined land now encompassed over 370 acres, which was a proper ranch by any measure, and Benjamin drew the new property lines on a map he pinned to the wall of his office with the satisfaction of a man who is watching a long-held intention become reality. Bessie, returning to the schoolhouse that fall with Thomas deposited happily with Edna, found that her classroom had grown to 30 students, the largest enrollment in the school's brief history, because the population of Caldwell was expanding. The cattle trade was still active, but farmers were beginning to arrive in larger numbers, drawn by the promise of available land and the improving political climate of a county no longer controlled by Vernon Ash's network. Ash's trial came in October. He was convicted on 3 of 4 counts of fraud in Sedgwick County and sentenced to 6 years in the Kansas State Penitentiary. The conviction was reported in every paper in the region. Bessie read the report at breakfast and passed it to Benjamin without comment, and he read it and set it aside and said, "Good," and poured more coffee, and that was the end of Vernon Ash as a force in their lives. A full accounting came out in the trial about how many families Ash's operation had destroyed. Bessie read each name in the newspaper reports with a kind of sorrowful anger. Some families had lost land they had spent years building. Some had been driven from the county entirely. The injustice of it was enormous and only partially remedied by a single conviction, because the land was gone and the years were gone, and those families were not coming back. She wrote a careful letter to the Attorney General's office asking what remedy, if any, was available to the dispossessed families, and received a careful letter back explaining that the legal mechanism for recovery was limited, but that her inquiry had been forwarded to the relevant department. It was not enough, but it was something, and she taught her students about it that winter in the way she taught them everything, directly, clearly, with the acknowledgement that justice was something people had to make happen rather than something that arrived on its own. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was quiet in the best way. Thomas grew from a newborn into a baby with opinions about things, about when he wanted to be held and when he wanted to be put down, and which of his parents' faces he found most amusing, which changed daily. Benjamin, Bessie noted with deep affection, was comprehensively disarmed by his son in a way that nothing else in the world managed. The steady, still man who moved through every difficulty with contained composure would sit on the parlor floor with Thomas pulling at his fingers and make the most undignified sounds with complete unself-consciousness. She told him once, watching this, that fatherhood had ruined his reputation as an intimidating person. He looked up at her with Thomas in his lap and said, "Good," and meant it entirely. The railroad confirmation came in the spring of 1884. The Santa Fe extension route was officially announced, and the proposed water tower and maintenance yard location was exactly where Benjamin had predicted 18 months earlier, the southeast corner of Bessie's 40 acres on Bluff Creek. The railroad agent came to call in April with a formal offer. Bessie and Benjamin sat across from the agent in their parlor, Thomas asleep in the back room, Edna's best coffee on the table, and listened to the offer, which was $11,000 for the 30-acre parcel the railroad required, with the remaining 10 acres retained by them. She looked at the agent. She looked at Benjamin. Benjamin looked at her with the particular patience of a man who had learned, over the preceding 18 months, to let her lead the negotiations. "We will need 3 days to consider the offer," Bessie said, with the schoolmistress composure that had once kept a school board from firing her unjustly, "and we will have a written response for you by Friday." The agent, who had expected either immediate enthusiasm or the haggling of inexperience, looked slightly surprised and agreed. When he had gone, she and Benjamin sat together at the kitchen table and looked at the number on the paper. $11,000. The debt that had nearly destroyed her, that had felt like a stone wall between her and any possible future when she arrived in Caldwell with $43, had inverted into the foundation of a genuinely substantial life. "We should counter," she said. 12,000, he said. 12,500, she said. He thought about it. 12,500, he agreed. They settled with the railroad at $12,200, and the 30 acres were surveyed and transferred in June. The remaining 10 acres along the north end of the creek they kept, cleared, and converted to the kitchen garden, an orchard that Bessie had been planning in her mind since the previous winter. Apple trees and plum trees and a kitchen garden large enough to produce a serious portion of their household food, and a small structure for the bees that Benjamin built to her specification, and that her first-year beekeeping produced enough honey. From that they were able to trade the surplus at the Caldwell General Store for credit. The summer of 1884 was golden in the way of summers that happened to fall exactly right, not too dry, not too wet, warm without being brutal. Thomas was walking, which he did with the enthusiastic instability of a child who had decided he was fully mobile and was not going to let balance slow him down. Bessie was teaching summer school, a new initiative she had proposed to the school board for the children who needed extra help, funded by a small fee from families who could pay it and free to those who could not. She found out she was expecting again in August. This time she told Benjamin the same day she was certain, because she had learned that managing news alone when there was someone who wanted to share it was an old habit and not necessarily a wise one. He was at the fence line in the evening, checking repairs after a storm, and she rode out to him on Sam, who was getting older but still steady. "We are going to need to think about a larger kitchen garden for next year," she said by way of opening. He looked at her. "For practical reasons," she said. He understood immediately. She saw it, and the expression on his face was the same as it had been in February of 1883, except this time more certain, less stunned, more settled into joy. "Spring," he said. "March," she said. He lifted her down from the horse with careful hands and held her in the warm evening air of the August prairie and said, into her hair, "Good. Thomas needs someone to blame when things go wrong." She laughed against his shoulder. Their daughter was born in March of 1885 in the same house, with the same Edna in attendance. She arrived with red gold hair and an immediate vocal opinion of the world, which she announced at considerable volume for the first several minutes of her existence. They named her Catherine, and from the first day she was completely in charge of every room she was in. Thomas, at 1 year and 8 months, considered his sister with the judicial gravity of a small person determining where this new thing fit in his understanding of the world, and within a week had arrived at the conclusion that she was primarily entertainment and secondarily something to protect from perceived hazards, which he took extremely seriously despite being barely 2 feet tall himself. Benjamin looked at both of his children in the lamplight of their bedroom on Catherine's first night, and then at Bessie, who was exhausted and content in the specific way of a woman who has just accomplished something significant, and he said nothing. He simply held her hand and was entirely present, which was what she needed and which he somehow always knew. The life they were building was not simple lives with substance never are. There were difficult years in cattle prices and difficult years in weather, and the permanent ongoing labor of running a ranch and teaching school and raising 2 children who were both, in their different ways, absolutely determined people. There were nights when Bessie was so tired she fell asleep at the kitchen table over her lesson plans, and woke to find Benjamin had covered her with a blanket rather than wake her. There were mornings when the ranch demanded Benjamin's entire self before dawn, and he came in at noon too tired to eat, and she made him sit down and fed him, and told him what Thomas had said that morning and watched the tiredness leave his face. The Caldwell they lived in by 1885 and 1886 was a changed town. The cattle trade was diminishing as the open range closed and homesteaders fenced the land, and the character of the community was shifting from cattle town to agricultural settlement. It was not always a comfortable transition. The cowboys who had driven cattle north for a decade found their era ending, and did not universally manage the discovery gracefully. New families arrived with different expectations and different backgrounds. Bessie's schoolroom reflected this. Children from families who had been in Kansas a decade sitting alongside children who had arrived last month from Ohio or Tennessee or Georgia. She taught them all, and she made the room a place where what mattered was what you could learn, not where you had come from or what your father did. And she was not perfect at this, but she was consistent and persistent in it. And the students who were in her classroom during those years carried something from it that showed up later in how they moved through the world. In 1886, the school board asked her to take on a second teacher to handle the growing enrollment. She hired a young woman from Lawrence, 22 years old, a recent certificate holder, clearly competent and slightly terrified in exactly the way Bessie recognized, and spent considerable energy in that first year making certain the young woman knew she was doing well, because Bessie remembered very clearly what it was to be 24 and alone and determined and frightened, and in need of someone who would simply acknowledge that you were capable. Benjamin expanded the ranch in 1886 by purchasing an additional 80 acres to the east, which brought the total to just over 450 acres. He hired a 5th hand and began to focus the operation more intentionally on breeding quality stock rather than simply running numbers. It was a longer-term strategy that demanded patience, but patience was not a quality Benjamin Stone had ever lacked. Catherine at 2 years old was, as she had promised to be on the night of her birth, entirely in charge. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stillness, which she deployed strategically and with considerable effect. Thomas at 3 was earnest and methodical, and already showed signs of his father's careful deliberation about everything, which Bessie found deeply endearing and occasionally maddening, because she wanted him to sometimes just grab the toy without analyzing the situation first. It was Thomas who gave them the third pregnancy announcement, without knowing he was doing so. He was 3.5 and standing in the kitchen while Bessie was sick at the basin one morning, and he said, with complete confidence, "That means there is another baby coming." Bessie looked at him. "That is what happened before Catherine," he said, as if this were an established scientific principle. She looked at Benjamin, who was standing in the kitchen doorway, and he was trying extremely hard not to smile. "Thomas," she said, with the composure of a schoolmistress, "that is perceptive of you." "I know," Thomas said, and went back to his breakfast. Their second son was born in the fall of 1887. They named him Samuel, for the steady roan gelding who had carried Bessie to Bluff Creek on that first Sunday morning, because Benjamin said when she proposed it that it was the most practical tribute to a horse he had ever heard, and she said that she intended to be a practical woman, and he said that she had always been exactly that and considerably more besides. The year 1888 brought news that surprised both of them. Lawyer Prout wrote to inform them that the Attorney General's office, as a result of the ongoing proceedings in the Ash case, had established a limited fund to compensate families who had lost property through the fraudulent scheme. Two of the families they had learned about through the trial, a family named Mueller who had lost their homestead, and a widow named Mrs. Carlin who had lost her water rights, had been partially compensated through the fund. It was not everything they had lost. It never could be. But it was something, and Bessie read the letter aloud to Benjamin at the kitchen table and felt the complicated satisfaction of knowing that the fight they had fought had been worth more than just their own property. She wrote to Prout asking that their names be formally submitted as witnesses in support of any remaining claims from the Ash operation, and Prout confirmed that would be arranged. The schoolhouse by 1888 had been expanded. The school board had funded an addition, doubling the original space, to accommodate the growing population. Bessie's assistant, who was now no longer terrified and was in fact excellent, managed the older students while Bessie handled the younger ones, and the Caldwell Prairie School had developed a reputation in the county for producing students who could think and not merely recite. In the evenings, the house at Bluff Creek held more life than it had ever held. 3 children in various stages of motion, the reliable warmth of the kitchen stove, Benjamin's account book spread on the table beside Bessie's lesson plans, the mockingbird that had taken up residence in the cottonwood outside the window and performed his comprehensive repertoire through the warm months. On a particular evening in the late summer of 1888, Bessie sat on the porch, their porch, the one where she had first come to him with her terrible and wonderful proposal, with the evening spreading itself out over the prairie in gold and amber, and the sound of Benjamin reading to the children in the parlor coming through the open window, Thomas making increasingly dubious objections to whatever part of the story Benjamin was currently delivering, and Catherine making authoritative commentary on Thomas's objections, and Samuel, who was not yet a year old, providing enthusiastic nonsense syllables as his contribution. Benjamin's voice, steady and warm, navigating all of this with patient amusement. She thought about the woman who had stepped off the train in Caldwell 6 years earlier with $43 and a teaching certificate and a dead father's impossible debts, certain that she would manage it alone because she always had, because alone was simply the condition of her life and you managed what you had. She thought about how wrong she had been, not about her capacity to manage, she had that, but about the alone part. She thought about a man in a school doorway on a Saturday afternoon, asking if he could help hang a map, and the rest of it, everything that had come after spreading out behind her like the prairie she was looking at, vast and real and hers. Benjamin came out to the porch 20 minutes later. The children were asleep, or at least occupying themselves in the direction of sleep, which at this house meant approximately the same thing. He settled into the chair beside her, the one that had become his over years of evening use, and looked at the same prairie. She took his hand, the way she had on the Wichita courthouse steps on the day they won, and held it. "I was thinking," she said, "about the day I arrived." "Frightened," he said. "I was not going to admit that," she said. "I know," he said. "You still were. Edna told you." "Edna did not need to tell me," he said. "You were managing it beautifully, but yes, you were frightened." She was quiet for a moment. "Were you frightened that first day when you came to the schoolhouse?" He was quiet in the way of a man being genuinely honest with himself before speaking. "Yes," he said. "Though not about what you were frightened about. What were you frightened about?" He turned to look at her, and in the evening light he had the same face he had always had, the angular, sun-darkened, gray-eyed face of a man who said what he meant and meant what he said, and had never needed to perform anything for anyone. And in it was everything that 6 years of a shared life had added. All the children and the court cases, and the difficult winters and the easy summers and the 1,000 evenings exactly like this one. "I was frightened," he said, "that I had already decided something about you in the first 3 minutes, and that I was going to be required to be sensible about it, which was going to be extremely difficult." She looked at him. "In the first 3 minutes. You told me you would not be bullied out of your inheritance," he said. "You said it quietly. You meant every word. I was finished." She laughed, and it came out free and warm the way her laughs always were with him, the way that had taken him by surprise in those first weeks and never stopped being true. "I love you," she said, and it was simple and enormous and entirely ordinary in the best way, the way things are when they are so true they have become just the texture of life. "I love you," he said, and held her hand in both of his in the evening that was going gold around them. Across the Bluff Creek land, where the water tower stood now on the railroad right-of-way visible from the porch on a clear evening, a useful structure in the middle of useful land, the mockingbird in the cottonwood was running through his catalog. Somewhere in the pasture, the cattle were settling. The grass moved in its long perpetual wave. The sky went from gold to amber to the deep clear violet of a Kansas evening giving way to night. Thomas appeared at the door in his nightshirt with the authority of a small person who had decided sleep was happening to someone else. Benjamin looked at him with the expression Bessie would never stop treasuring, warm and patient and entirely invested. "Bed," Benjamin said mildly. Thomas considered this. "5 more minutes," he said. 2 minutes, Benjamin said. "Then bed." Thomas sat on the top porch step with the negotiating satisfaction of someone who has obtained terms, and Benjamin and Bessie sat in their chairs in the warm evening and watched him watch the prairie. And the 2 minutes became 5, and then the crickets started their evening conversation, and Thomas became sufficiently sleepy that he allowed himself to be carried inside without objection. Bessie sat alone on the porch for a few more minutes after they had gone in, looking at the property that had started everything, the 40 acres that had arrived in her life as a problem and become, through the alchemy of a particular summer and a particular man and a particular legal battle and the long patient work of building something real, into a foundation. Benjamin came back out and stood in the doorway and looked at her. "Coming in," he said. She rose from her chair, smoothed her skirt, and crossed the porch to him. He put his arm around her in the doorway, and they stood for a moment looking out at the prairie together, the vast dark prairie with its one bright water tower, and its 1,000 moving grasses, and its enormous sky beginning to show its first stars. "Yes," she said, and they went inside. The lamp in the window of the house at Bluff Creek burned a good long time after that.